Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back after lunch. Our first session, Crisis of Credibility, Fighting Fake News. Pratik Sinha, R. Jagannathan, Sanjay Pinto, Sriram Lakshman, and Suhasini Haidar in conversation with Sethi. Pratik Sinha is a co-founder of Alt News, a fact-checking website that researches and debunks misinformation or disinformation. He's worked as a software engineer for 13 years in India, US, and Vietnam. R. Jagannathan is a journalist with over 42 years' experience in business and general journalism. He is now editorial director of Swarajya magazine, a project associated with Rajaji, but which went defunct after his passing away. Sanjay Pinto is an advocate at the Madras High Court, a columnist and author. Before his transition from the newsroom to the courtroom, Sanjay was the face of NDTV in South India for 15 years. Sanjay appears on primetime TV debates as a political analyst and is the author of 3 books. Sriram Lakshman is the Hindu's United States correspondent based in Washington, D.C. Prior to this, he was a senior deputy editor with the newspaper in Chennai. His writing has included topics such as data privacy, trade wars, and artificial intelligence. Suhasini Haidar is the diplomatic editor of The Hindu and writes regularly on foreign policy issues. Prior to this, Suhasini was foreign affairs editor and primetime anchor at CNN-IBN, where she presented the signature show, Worldview with Suhasini Haidar. Sethi was a consulting editor of Seminar for over 20 years. He was a fellow at the Center for Studies in Developing Societies. He was earlier the deputy director of the Indian Council of Social Science Research. Pratik Sinha will be joining us shortly. I think he's almost here, but we will continue the session so that we will have enough time for a good discussion. Crisis of Credibility, Fighting Fake News. Please welcome R. Jagannathan, Sanjay Pinto, Sriram Lakshman, and Suhasini Haidar, and Sethi.
Good afternoon. I suspect a full house means that everybody is usually concerned about this phenomena called fake news. We have here 5 practitioners from different fields who I hope will inform both you and me as another consumer of news in terms of the specific problems they face in their reporting, in their writing, in the areas that they are most concerned with, which range from foreign policy to domestic politics, etc., etc. I would just like to take a couple of minutes to set the tone. I'm very uneasy with the word fake news, because once you've called a news fake, then there's very little to debate about it. I mean, it's fake, therefore necessarily it needs to be dismissed out of hand. I think the more important and more interesting part is this business of crisis of credibility. I mean, for those of us who are older and remember a time when there was no TV, clearly no social media, no internet, none of this, and all we relied on were newspapers and the print to get some idea of what is happening in the world around us and what people are doing or not doing. It was almost taken as an axiom that if it's reported in the newspaper, it must be true. All right. I don't think over the last 20 or 30 years, anyone actually ever believes it. Not only because the nature of the news business has changed, the nature of the newspapers have changed, the distinction between reporting and editorializing, between opinion and fact, etc., have changed. A whole range of new mediums have entered the game, and now you have, a very large number of us have smartphones on which you are constantly being fed with all kinds of information, both written and visual, and videos, moving images, about things that you actually do not know whether they are true or not true. The shift in technology from the time when I was a student to now as a senior citizen has been so dramatic, and its impact on our lives and our thinking and our views and our desire to both believe and to act or to not believe and act has been so profound that it is something which is deeply, deeply unsettling. It is important for all of us to realize that we need to believe in something, in someone, to take a little bit more for granted, that if the news comes from this, it must be somewhat more reliable. But once we lose this business and everything becomes relative and everything has to be assessed, very few of us have either the capability or the experience or the expertise or the time to be able to sift out what is being presented to us, how reliable or not reliable it is. And this brings me to my final point. Critical to the business of both making news and purveying news and views is an institutional mechanism which seeks to sift out what is a little less reliable, what is a little more reliable, present it in different ways, use language in a certain way, which is what we expected newspaper editorial staffs or TV editorial staffs to do. Things were supposed to be verified, unsourced reports were not supposed to be put out, something which is handed out to you by a corporation or by a state or by a party or whoever is more powerful and has the ability to hand out things was not expected to be taken at face value. And when it is actually put out for larger consumption, the expectation was somebody has gone through it, somebody who knows more than us. And therefore, let's take it not by dismissal, but as something to be taken seriously. Now, that's the basic backdrop within which the shifts in technology, the creation of new news, the creation of photographs, morphing, what Ravish Kumar constantly calls the WhatsApp university for transmitting things, etc., have acquired a kind of larger-than-life dimension. Now, we have here, as I said, 5 practitioners in the areas of foreign policy, politics, someone whose business it is to try and warn us in terms of what is fake and what is not fake. Suhasini, who writes on diplomacy, foreign policy, etc., and Sanjay Pinto, who claims to have been now on both sides of the fence, both as a purveyor of news and views and as someone who has to deal with the fallouts and implications of that, particularly it acquires a legal thing. Now, the way we are going to do it is we will have, well, shorter, 2, 3, 4 minutes, opening statements from the practitioners as to what particular view they might like to highlight in the areas that bother them the most or they know about more. And then we will take it on from there. And we would like to keep 10 or 15 minutes towards the end for questions from the audience, because I know all of you are deeply concerned about what you think is being fed to you and how seriously you should take what is actually being dished out to you. So we'll start with you.
Thanks, Harsh. As part of my opening remarks, so I work as a foreign correspondent in the US, and my job is technically to cover everything from Mickey Mouse to Mueller, as I like to say. So my experience is probably a little bit different from those here. It's also different because at the moment, one of the chief sources of fake news, and I'm using that term loosely now, is probably the most important person in the United States and, like it or not, the world. So I'm going to open by giving you a few facts and respond to some of Harsh's comments, and we can take it from there. The first is the Washington Post tracks how many false claims Donald Trump makes, and he's made a total of 7,645 false claims in 710 days. That's more than 100 false claims in a day on average. CNN, according to CNN, he's mentioned fake news, the phrase, some 210 times in 2018. Some other facts from the last few years, since some research findings. There's limited research so far, and I'll come back to that. I looked through the research on this, and some other findings that have emerged include the result that seniors, those above 65, tend to share misinformation online more than younger people. Conservatives tend to share misinformation more than moderates and liberals. Since 2016, there's limited evidence to show that the sharing of misinformation on Facebook has gone down, and it's increased on Twitter. And this is from research from Stanford University and NYU, and it's possibly because Facebook has taken more steps to curb misinformation. So I just want to leave you with those results for now. And in response to what Harsh said, I think we need to, I agree with him, fake news is a fairly loose term, and a crisis of credibility is probably a better phrase to describe what we're going through, because fake news is a term people apply to different things. Misinformation, memes, and you know, some wonderful sites like The Onion or the Borowitz Report, part of the New Yorker, that's pure satire, but those have also been impacted because of the crisis of credibility. So first and foremost, we need to start defining what fake news is so that we can better understand it and tackle it. And lastly, I want to say, I agree with Harsh, the change in technology has been so dramatic that we are indeed all a bit unsettled. Even, I don't want to speak for everybody here as a journalist, I certainly am, and I know some other colleagues are as well. And we're still trying to find our way through it. We don't have all the solutions, but I think the responsibility for tackling this problem lies with media organizations as well as you as the final consumer of news.
Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that anonymity and credibility cannot go together. I'd like to give you a few examples. When you have to start a newspaper, you have to go to the magistrate and give a declaration. When you start a TV channel, you get an uplink and a downlink license. When you start a radio channel, a radio station, you need to get a GOPA government permission from the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. When you get a mobile SIM, you have to give proof of your address, proof of your identity. When you need what they call that caller line identification restriction, where your number doesn't appear, you need a letter from the Chief of Intelligence of the State Police. You need verification by the telecom provider. And you need further approval by the telecom ministry. But to start a social media account, you need nothing, ladies and gentlemen. And that really is the crux of the problem. Because this is what has led, the social media today has become the biggest vehicle of fake news in the country. The biggest vehicle. And that is why you have this syndrome of hide and tweet, when people don't own, they can hide. And you know, if imagine you didn't have a caller line, if you didn't know who was calling you, the kind of, I remember when I was in school, we used to get those bomb hoax calls on the day of the exams. That's because you didn't have any way of immediately finding out who made those calls. Now, regulation, in fact, the government now has taken it seriously to some extent, I would say, where they've asked these intermediaries who have created a monster to rein in that monster themselves. There has never been any regulation. There's been no self-regulation in this biggest vehicle of fake news in the past. Consider this. I'm a journalist turned lawyer now, so I am governed by rules of the Bar Council. Doctors are governed by the Medical Council. The advertising industry has got the Advertising Standards Council of India. The media has got the Press Council. The electronic media has got the National Broadcasters Association. Banks have the Banking Ombudsman. Insurance companies have the IRDA. And the social media? Zilch. And this really is the root of the problem, ladies and gentlemen. This is how abuse thrives. And in fact, social media, it's good that on Bogi, it's time to perhaps make a start to make a bonfire of fake news in our country. And the best way to do that is to rein in the social media, where intermediaries have to be made accountable. The government, in fact, has amended, in fact, there's a draft amendment on Section 79(3)(b) of the Information Technology Act, where the onus is now on these intermediaries to actually divulge certain data, which was not the case earlier.
Thank you. From the behavior of the lawyers of Madras High Court and lower courts, it doesn't look like they're regulated by anybody. I mean, sorry, that was just an aside. There are two issues here. One is fake news, and the second thing is fake narrative. This comes from two basic things. Human beings are suckers for stories. And in journalism, the first thing you're told is try and see what is the story. Right? You're not told to say, just say what you've seen or what you have observed. They say make a story out of it. So the minute you have to make a story out of facts or unconnected facts, you will by definition have an element of fakeness in it. The second thing is, of course, what I said, because we are suckers for stories, and secondly, we are also divided by ideology. The minute you say, I believe in X ideology or Y, it automatically serves as a blind spot when you're looking for certain kind of stories because you're blinded by ideology A or ideology B. You're going to look for facts that support your ideology. You're not going to look for facts that go against your ideology, right? So the sucker for stories and the fact that a lot of us, by the time we get into journalism, have our own ideologies, will mean that you will have fake narratives coming, connecting unconnected events or drawing the wrong conclusions. The same set of data can mean one thing to another person, one thing to you. That's the kind of thing it works. Like, I mean, I give you a simple example. I mean, we all talk about farmer suicides, right? Every single suicide is a huge tragedy, human tragedy, and it's not right to belittle it. But the point is when half the country consists of farmers or farming-related people, and the suicide rate of farmers is 18%, I would say that actually the suicide rate is far less than what it should be if you think it's so bad, right? Now my point is because of the absolute numbers it's very bad, but in terms of the narrative to say that this particular group of citizens is actually more prone to committing suicide is a false narrative. What I'm trying to say is that you have to prevent that. Even one single suicide is wrong. But but it's not fake news. We know that thousands of farmers commit suicide, so that part is not fake. But the narrative is fake because people do not die for one reason that I am indebted, therefore I'll commit suicide. People commit suicide for a variety of reasons. So I am saying we need to really worry about fake narratives as much, if not more, than fake news alone. Fake news has been enabled by technology which allows the fast transmission of something wrong, which somebody has done that. But I think what technology creates, ultimately technology can control. Basically, it does not take much for a artificial intelligence algorithm to quickly match whatever you have tweeted or put on a Facebook post and check if it is a mock photo or something like that. You don't need thousands of people to go and check and all that. So my guess is that the fake news or all these mock pictures thing can probably be sorted out substantially, 80% through technology in the next 3 years. But fake narratives will continue to live on, and that's what bothers me.
So I hope you note that we are now dealing both with news and the manner within which we string our facts together to tell a story. There is a difference between, and just before we get on to Suhasini, I mean, anyone who's done research knows that we may be dealing with the same sets of data, but there are different ways within which we interpret it. Is one a fake interpretation? Is one a true interpretation? I mean, that's a very dicey area to get into. And that's why the important thing is that when you do your research and you want to publish it in a journal, there is supposed to be an editorial board, there are supposed to be outside referees who will say, have you looked at it properly? Have you not looked at it properly? Is your methodology sound, not sound? Are you over-reading, under-reading, etc., etc., etc.? Similarly, in the news business, I'm saying you are entitled to your story. I'm saying all of us go to the same place and we see different things. A crime takes place, somebody talks to the police, somebody talks to the victim, somebody talks to the neighbor. I mean, we all know it. There's nothing particularly new about it. In terms of your inflection and opinion, which is what is called your op-ed writing, you may feel that mainstream newspapers, in the language in which you're working, tend to overplay certain kinds of stories and do not report on other kinds of stories. All right? Now, those are different kinds of editorial decisions that groups make. It is put out. We expect that it is put out through a particular process. And this diversity of presentation, of news, of stories, and a very horrid word which is very common these days, narratives. It's fine, it's healthy, it's plural. I mean, we are a complicated, all societies are complicated. We like to think we are more complicated than others. So this is fine. The problem often is with the first part, which Jagannathan is saying is maybe as important, maybe not as important as the other, which is, are you clearly concocting material? Not in terms of your methodology, but are you clearly concocting material? Now, is this different from propaganda, within which we take our best face and we put it forward and we try and present it as this is all there is to it? Are we always looking only for balance? Now, those are more gray area questions, which I'm saying, things which happen within your neighborhood, which you also may have had somewhat more direct experience of. You have some way of assessing and filtering for yourself as consumers. But when we come to areas which are somewhat more far away, or more complicated, or more hidden, areas that Suhasini works on, the making of foreign policy, what is happening in distant lands, how we get this information or don't get this information, and what implication it has to the settling of our views. That somebody can take a video from Afghanistan and show it is as part of somewhere else, and we tend to believe it because it's been repeated so often, or it has come from so many different sources, that it forms our mindset, which makes us more prone to believe certain kinds of stories or not. So I'll turn to Suhasini.
Thanks a lot. And with all due respect to everyone who's spoken before, I think we are complicating an issue that's actually quite simple. Journalism is not that difficult. It is quite simple. So with all due respect to what Mr. Jagannathan said, I do believe that if one cannot be complacent about the idea that journalists are coming with ideologies. That's just bad journalism. Are they double sourcing their stories? Are they getting the facts out very clearly? If they are talking about analysis or opinions, then is that on the opinion and editorial page and not in the news page? So I think we shouldn't complicate it because it leads to a problem which I do want to get to in just a minute. When you talk about, Sriram mentioned the fount of fake news, if you like, there in the United States. A few months ago, I went to Bhutan, arguably one of the world's smallest and certainly one of the youngest democracies. And I asked the leader of one of the main political parties there, what do you think is the main issue for you in this election? And he said fake news. And I was a bit surprised by that because I didn't realize that fake news had reached such proportions that even there in the most, the tiniest democracy, 460,000 voters, I think, that fake news was an issue. But what he was essentially saying was that part of fake news which is false news. So therefore, let us clarify what we are talking about. When we say fake news, we are using terms that are used by political establishments to discredit all journalism. There are several types of the news that they are referring to. They refer to false news, which is very simply false. A story didn't happen. We write a story to say the Prime Minister has decided to go to Botswana, and then somebody denies it and says, no, he didn't go. It's a false story. There are other types of things that are clubbed in this idea of fake news, and that is news with a certain bias that, as I said right now, does not have a place essentially in journalism and certainly not in news pages of a newspaper. And then there is the third type of news, which is an unsourced story, inadequately sourced story, because of course we know that there are two sides of every story. So if I take just some spokesperson of a party's version in a paper, and he says falsehoods, or she says something that is false, and I don't put the context in there, then I'm inadequately sourcing. It's not good enough for me as a journalist to say so-and-so said it, so it must, I just have to report what is said there, or in a press release, or in a handout, or in these days more increasingly sources said a WhatsApp message that I received from somebody important. So there is all of these things, which is just bad journalism, that is now being used in the terminology fake news. Where does that terminology fake news come from? And this is what I would like to really address, because I think we are not we are not really threatened by falsehoods being passed around. Eventually, competition in the news, people like Pratik and others will ensure that over time there is fact checks. This is not the first time in history that people try to spread rumors or try to spread wrong stories about people. But this is the first time we are seeing consistent three-pronged attacks on journalists as a community. The idea is not that you are a bad journalist or you are a good journalist. The idea is that journalism is irrelevant because we now have political establishments who want to deal directly. As a journalist, your only job should be to be the post office. And when the political establishment puts out a message, that is the message you should be disseminating, like the postman. But that's not the truth, ladies and gentlemen, and that's why I think we should not dwell too much on this idea of fake news. It is something created in order to brand all journalism as irrelevant, take it out of the picture entirely. And I'm happy to debate this further, but I think we should worry about that threat. The threat that comes from the idea that the moment somebody puts out a story that is inconvenient for one political establishment or the opposition, both of them, frankly, would like to use journalism in the same way. A story comes out that is not convenient to you. The response to that in the old days would be a denial or a statement to say, even if the facts are correct, I disagree with the conclusion of this story. That would have been the old way to do it. Today, what happens is an official denial comes out. The denial might actually be denying facts that are true. The second part of it is a political agenda is attributed to the journalist. Sometimes we hear it, as we did with the leader of the opposition, using the word pliant. Our Prime Minister uses the word news traders all the time. Our Minister of State for External Affairs uses the term prostitutes. We know what that is supposed to sound like. So that's the second part of this three-pronged attack. And the third pronged attack is the one that all of us are talking about, the social media, that comes bang on with all kinds of stories that discredit, again, the journalist. Not just the story, but also the journalist. And the creation in the last few years of websites, that it is no secret that those websites belong to certain political parties that regularly put out falsities about journalists. If you want me to name them, I'm happy to name them, but we all know which ones they are. Those are part of a political part of a political program. So I don't think we need to turn this entire debate on fake news just into what is it that journalists are putting out. I think there's something more insidious than that.
I think that's extremely well said, because yes, there are attacks on the media and attacks on the media by political establishments, and we consistently say, attribute motives. But I do think, with due respect, Suhasini, that there is a problem which is an external problem to the world of media, and there is an internal problem to the world of media. I mean, the media that we thought of as the media, again, at the time when I was a student, to now is very different. This is not a media which deals only with news and views on newspapers or TV channels. It also deals with corporations. It also deals with the fact that their owners are often members of or representatives of political parties. There are many agendas which are being played out simultaneously. We had all heard of, in the early days, planted news in the business pages of newspapers. We'd all learned about how one of the biggest media houses in the country had set up companies or parts of their company to filter news which are really advertisement or falsities and report it as corporate news in exchange for advertising revenue or shares in so companies were set up. We've seen, not just companies and governments, political parties, other establishments, do all kinds of things to ensure what they called was favorable coverage and preferential treatment to those who are willing to give them favorable coverage. That's one part. the debate between what was supposed to be only on analytic pages or the editorial or the op-ed pages shifting into the news spaces is again a fairly old problem. All right. Clearly, are we dealing with the same kind of animal, albeit with different technological implications and social implications? Or are we actually, have we entered what in early crude Marxist parlance used to be called quantity turning into quality? Is there a qualitative change in the world in which we are living? Not just in terms of the nature of impact, but in terms of our understanding of what is true, what is reliable, what is worthwhile, and how do we create structures to both govern ourselves and to understand ourselves, I think. But we would now like to turn to Pratik, whose job it is, or who has taken it upon himself, the job of making us a little more vigilant about what is it that we are being told.
Thank you. So I'm not from the journalism industry. I'm a software engineer by training. And I believe that there's a bit of a blind spot when it comes to mainstream media journalists, in the sense that I think there's a belief that news is only in the form of print media or TV channel, and news doesn't go beyond that. I think that's a bit of a blind spot. What we have seen increasingly is that social media, you put something on social media and it goes viral and people actually believe it. That is news as well, because you're using a medium which is not print, not TV, but an unregulated medium like social media, where you're putting out information and trying to convince people of certain things. For example, recently, we have seen all the mob lynchings that have happened, where people were told that, there are kidnappers out there on the prowl, and they're going to kidnap your children, they're going to traffic them. And there's a large section of population for various reasons. It could be one, lack of internet literacy, lack of any kind of literacy, and two, their own personal biases. They fall for this information, they forward the information, and it actually becomes actual knowledge in citizenry. So, for example, there's constant thing going about Jawaharlal Nehru. For example, it is claimed that one of the stories that we did very recently were, there's a WhatsApp forward which says that Jawaharlal Nehru said that, I'm Englishman by birth, I'm Muslim by, something to that effect. And what we found was that the statement was originally made in 1959 by a Hindu Mahasabha leader called N.B. Khare in a book. And that has been propagated for so many years and attributing it directly to Jawaharlal Nehru. Now, that is the domain we work, alt news works in. And I would briefly want to touch upon what we are trying to do. What we are trying to do is, at this point of time, it's more of a journalistic approach that, we get a WhatsApp forward, or we see something on social media. We have various ways of monitoring things that are going around on social media. And we fact check it using certain technological tools, or by calling up people, which is more a regular form of journalism, and we put out the stories. The failure the challenges that we face is that the people who are reading our stories and the people who are actually getting affected by misinformation, they're largely different subsets. We are unable to reach the people who are actually getting affected by misinformation. The reason for that is, number one, social media, as it has been correctly pointed out, rumors have been there all along, but it is social media which has come along and has given a velocity which was not there before. And that is what needs to curb. Unfortunately, most of the social media companies do not acknowledge this problem, partly because of a large chunk of their business runs on things going viral. It is that is how they can serve more ads, et cetera, and the money comes from that. For example, Twitter does not even acknowledge, if you go to Twitter and if you try to report something, there's no option called report false news. Facebook now has it, but in my opinion, they are not doing enough. It is more of a PR exercise right now than anything else. There are many tools out there, there's enough technology out there which can deal with this situation much better than what it is being done now. So in absence of the social media platforms doing it, what we are doing, and especially because some of us in Alt News have a software background, right now we are trying to come up with software which will do some of the automation. That is, if you get a video or an image and which is false in nature, either the text below that has come along with it is false, what we will do is we'll use technology to automatically identify that this video or image has been circulated with a false narrative, and will tell you what the correct narrative is. And we are doing this hoping that we will be able to, with enough promotion, we'll be able to reach the people who are not getting our, the correct information yet. Besides that, we're also trying to do some sort of, research based on our stories, because we have a very niche audience as to, where we are going wrong. We are trying to do some behavioral surveys to figure out, what can we do better. So yeah, that is what we're doing till now.
I hope with this first round we have had hopefully a somewhat better idea about what language to use with the kind of different phenomena that we're dealing with. Clearly nobody likes fake news as an all-encompassing category which is self-explanatory. It is not. But there are different parts of the problem. To some of these problems, we've suggested, or the experts here have suggested, some solutions or some way to filter its negative impact. There is no claim so far that I've heard from anyone saying, here is something which is true and here is something which is false. I mean, we're all dealing with different shades of gray, different interpretations, and we are not hostile to the idea of diversity of news and views. In fact, if there was no diversity of news and views, you might have had the old Stalinist newspaper or the Chinese Communist Party handout, or in more current parlance, whatever comes out of North Korea, as the singular and the only view. We should be careful that our regimes and our societies do not seek to move in that particular kind of direction. And the diversity of news sources, styles, languages, opinions continues. But because there is a problem, and I'd like to now complicate Pratik's thing. He said, there is a set of people, or there is a kind of audience which reads our stuff. But this is not the audience which is impacted by false news. You made some distinction. Again, to my mind, this is a somewhat shifty area. Often when we talk of those who are impacted by false news and rumors and tweets and WhatsApp forwards, etc., we have immediately the most gross things in mind. Lynching taking place because of rumors, action against a particular community taking place because there are rumors, something happens, or you report something happening in the Northeast, and all the Northeasterners have to run away from either Karnataka or Kerala because their lives are in danger. There are or lynching or something else taking place. But there is a more subtle thing which has consistently been happening through precisely the same set of news and views and jokes, which are very common, which is that they seek to mold the recipient into a particular kind of orientation. Now, you may claim that all political groups and entities try to sell their viewpoint and would like people to believe that. Does this new technology and this mode of doing it, does it lead to a qualitative change in the manner within which we believe? Why is it that some of the most outlandish claims which are put out on WhatsApp or Twitter are then circulated and recirculated by characters whom you think would know a little better? I mean, something which is often so gross and has been so denied so often. I mean, the commonest things in the last couple of years have been Nehru's parentage, or, Motilal Nehru something or the other, etc., where you can make all kinds of little personal allegations and attacks, unsourced. I mean, it would never get published, even by the worst publisher, unless you can put some corroborative evidence. The benefit here of this kind of form of communication and expansion is that you don't need to do it. Now, that doesn't bother me so much. What bothers me is why so many people buy into it. And I think that's something that we also need to talk about. Would you like to take your research-based comments forward in terms of what do we do to handle this?
Sure. I'm not a psychologist, but so I haven't actually done research on this, but I think there's some evidence to show that once you're already committed to a certain view, even when you receive information that would suggest, that contradicts your existing views, there's a cognitive bias. You don't update your views because it takes the most mature of egos to say, yes, I was wrong, I stand corrected. So I'm not quite sure that everybody receiving those WhatsApp messages about Pandit Nehru's parentage actually believes it, or doesn't think that if they invest a little time, they might come out with an alternative picture on that. But once you're committed to a certain ideology, even if you see something that would suggest you should correct it, you have a cognitive bias and you're unlikely to correct it. And also something that Sanjay said, there's a problem of anonymity these days on social media. The more something is shared, the more its truthiness, that's a feeling. Okay, something that's shared 10,000 times is probably more true than something that's shared 3 times. And also with the democratization of information, that's something the internet has done, everybody's become a pundit, everybody's become an expert, and it's very hard for the layperson to understand what is scholarly, what's opinion, what comes from a qualified journalist, and what somebody sitting in his living room is tweeting based on his opinion.
From what Suhasini had said earlier, I think the problem is not with journalists, it's about those who masquerade as journalists. Let me give you a small example. I remember when the Ayodhya verdict was supposed to be out earlier, just before that, the Information and Broadcasting Ministry sent out guidelines to every TV channel to specifically not air visuals of the mosque being demolished. Every single channel complied. There was not a single violation. Now imagine today with WhatsApp and all that, there is no control. I mean, as Pratik rightly said, this community standards. Which community? What standards? It's easier to pass a civil services exam today than to flag somebody for violation of community standards on the social media. I've noticed that. So I think the problem really is that the social media has taken over the mainstream media. And today, I'm glad Sriram, flagged that issue because Yale University had done research and pointed to echo chambers. So we need to ask ourselves, who are the biggest beneficiaries of fake news in the country? Who are these people who are the biggest beneficiaries? Now, I think just yesterday when Rahul Gandhi was in Dubai, there was some fake news doing the rounds about a 14-year-old girl allegedly asking him a question and Rahul Gandhi being stumped. Now, we all know that Rahul Gandhi is not the brightest politician, but then certainly he's not the pappu he is made out to be. And it turned out that that was some old photograph that was morphed. So you see, to fabricate is unethical, and correction is legal. That's why there are several legal, and that's probably why the Supreme Court did not decriminalize defamation in the country. Today, defamation also means, and there are a lot of people, and I must raise this issue very briefly, a lot of people put retweets are not endorsements. That's a dicey disclaimer. Retweets are fresh publication. So I think when you say retweets are not endorsement, because even in the Lanscanes versus Lalit Modi case, the UK court had very clearly spoke about the percolation effect on the internet. And that is something we should be aware of.
Could I just jump in? But I don't agree with Sanjay on criminal defamation, but that's the subject of a different panel altogether. But I do want to make the point that we cannot treat our readers and our viewers like empty vessels. I think one has to give them credit for that. And I take Pratik's point that it's to make distinctions between print and television on one side and social media on the other, on the internet on the other, is perhaps wrong. But to make a distinction between news organizations and simple social media groups, I don't think that's a problem. I think the fact is people know where they want to get their news from, and no, they do not believe their cousin as much as they believe tomorrow's newspaper. I think this idea that we need to make everyone, tar everyone with this one brush and say news is not credible anymore, when the fact is that newspapers, television channels, websites that are acclaimed and registered in various and are parts of regular news gathering, do take that extra time to do the fact checking. You have to give them credit for that. A news organization cannot just be, put aside by saying, well, I get my news from my WhatsApp as well as I get my news from newspapers, and sometimes I believe this and sometimes I believe that. I don't think that's the fact. I think people actually know who is credible and who they might enjoy what they are saying. As Sriram said, I may confirm my bias, but I'm not necessarily going to believe.
Then we'll open it up to questions for 5 minutes.
Yeah, so no, I don't think anybody here is saying that no news organization is credible. I don't think that is an issue. In fact, the story that Mr. Pinto spoke about is that yesterday this whole Rahul Gandhi thing, it was extremely viral, and one of the sentences in our story is that it has not been reported by any credible media organizations. That is one of the story based on which we said that prima facie that is why it is false. So nobody is saying that the news organizations are not credible anymore. Yes, there are other issues with multiple news organizations, but I'm not going into that. But the problem with this sort of misinformation is that no, people are not empty vessels. But when you have a certain bias, and let's say after India loses a match to Pakistan Champions Trophy, there are multiple videos which come out that Indian Muslims are celebrating Pakistan's win. We fact-checked that story. We found that only one video was true, and that was from Kashmir. Kashmir has a different situation. But when you have this kind of information coming again and again, it deepens our bias. And that is very dangerous, I believe, for the democracy of the country, when you have so many, you have your bias deepening every single day via the use of social media. And, politicians of different kinds, for example, in the last few days, we have done multiple stories of how Congress has come on the board and is putting out misinformation in a big manner. It's very rudimentary. They're taking certain Photoshop pictures and this and that. But at the end of the day, why political parties are investing so deeply, so much into WhatsApp groups is because they know that it has an impact. They are not fools to, invest so heavily into WhatsApp groups, because they know that if they can push the same narrative again and again, it has a cumulative effect on people.
I'm sorry.
Hello, can I? Okay.
Okay, Jagannathan, quickly.
Yeah, just 2-3 lines. One thing is what has happened with the democratization of the social media, what has happened is there are a lot of lumpen elements who got into it, who use the cover of anonymity, as Sanjay said, to abuse people, threaten people, or float false things. Okay, but I think we should not lose sight of the fact that ultimately, even in the old newspaper regime, stories are on the front page, denials are on page 17 in 2 lines. Okay, so the same thing happens. So when Pratik says that this is what's happening, yeah, it is always happening. Only thing is the scale and multiplicity and speed have changed. One more thing, I think we should not think that suddenly we need to put all kinds of restraints on social media. I think it is actually putting new questions to those who control various things. I think control is not the solution to it. You have to find some other solution to it.
Fine. We are going to stop our statement. We have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions, not more. Questions, please. No comments, no statements. I have very bad eyesight, so I see someone back there. I'll just point out 3 people. 1 minute, sir. There's someone back there. Yeah. Just stand up, please, so I know. You here, sir. And someone from here. Anyone? Clearly this side. All right, the lady at the back. So that's 3 questions. Short and sharp, please.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah.
The gentleman there who's speaking. No?
Can I ask a question?
Okay. Then you
Yeah,
ask
thank you very much. There is some reality check I think need to be conducted in the way. First, the question to be asked is, why is social media becoming more dominant? And that one of the reasons is that the print media is losing, or TV media is losing its credibility and objectivity over the time. And it's also a fact from a viewer's point of view that we get a lot of information about what is wrong with the print media or the TV media from the social media. Of course, the issue is, that's my question. That's my question. Sorry, I'll come to my question.
Please.
The question is, at least in social media, we know that we cannot believe mostly it is not correct. But what brings the problem is when we think that the print media or TV media is much more credible and when the news is fake. That's more of a problem.
The question I had, when I open the morning newspaper, it seems to me that most of the front page or a significant portion of the front page comprises of what one politician said about the other. The question I have is that how is that news? And number two is that why does it deserve to be on the front page?
That's a separate question. The lady at the back, and then we'll come.
Excuse me. I have to, Ms. Suhasini Haidar. What do we do to ensure that the political parties are not utilizing either the social media or the newspaper and other channels? What exactly can be done today, which is a very urgent need?
So, as journalists, what do you think is the balance between getting a report from a source and not letting the public know, just in case it's not true, and waiting for a long period of time before reporting it, running the risk of not letting the public know something at a critical point of time?
Okay, fine. Suhasini, would you like to start?
Very quickly, the answer to your question, honestly, everyone deals with it differently, but I'll go back to Bhutan, where one of the main newspapers decided, as you were asking, that it's not enough to just simply ignore false news. They started during the election a daily fake news column of their own and said, here's the stories that actually were wrong. And every day they would put out the stories that were actually wrong. In Bhutan, it's easier. It's a smaller country, and they were able to just look at a few WhatsApp groups and a few social media and get that column every day. But that's certainly worth thinking about. And ma'am, to your question, I think eventually it has to be, you're quite right, that the responsibility lies with the person putting out the falsehood. And it must be understood by political parties that it is not correct to either defame characters or to try and impute motives to journalists in order to get your point across. What is going to make political parties do that? I think they should be actually, at the same level that journalists are held responsible, I think it should be possible to hold political parties, particularly as we go into elections, also responsible with the same standards.
I just have a couple of comments to two questions. One is one politician saying something to another. Is that news? I'll talk from the US perspective. Last week, President Trump talked for about 8 minutes on border security. Some of you must have seen that. And there was a huge debate before that, various media organizations. Do we cover it? Because a lot of what this man says, usually it's the President of the United States, so it's truth. So it's news. And most of what he says, a lot of what he says is simply not true. So there is that debate. And I think it's very important that they had those debates publicly, because that itself educates the public that this is an issue. Some of the solutions were being discussed. Run the speech with a lag of a couple of minutes and do a fact check, a live fact check. There are ways to deal with it, but the point is it's important that we have these debates as a way to educating the public that there are these issues. And I can't remember the second question.
Jagannathan?
Yeah. No,
Anything that you want to add?
No, I think a lot of things that are generated by technology need to be fixed. I think Pratik himself said they're trying to use technology to speed up correction of news and make sure it goes. I think at some point, this can even be done automatically, because in the vast majority of simple fake news, it's complex fake news that probably needs human intervention. Those things need to be sorted out.
Pratik, last comments?
So, no, I don't think we can expect political parties to stop putting on, and I think it's unfair to expect that they would stop doing propaganda. I mean, it is their job to do propaganda and put out information that is in their favor. But I think what actually needs to be done, and again, it is unfair to expect that everybody will have the time and space to, check whether this video or this claim or anything that you received on social media has come from a credible source or is credible. I think what needs to be done is that, number one, more and more media organizations, currently India Today, I think ABP and Times of India has also started a small fact check. I think more and more media organizations needs to put out. Yes, we may not be a small country as small as Bhutan, but at least we can look at the major cases of misinformation from a day-to-day basis and have a regular column or a small TV slot, where we say that, this is the misinformation that has been put out, so that we can reach at least that portion of the population. And further, no, everything cannot be fact-checked using technology. There always needs to be human intelligence when it comes to fact-checking. But once it has been fact-checked, there is a scope of automation. And the hope is that, once we are able to make an example out of what we're doing, we're probably releasing this app by first week of March, then we are hoping that social media companies will take up and reduce the velocity. There is a need, videos which are completely false, which are, probably could cause violence in the society. They have no place on social media. And while we do not want to control social media, but we also want to make sure that social media doesn't become a source of violence in the country and, so on and so forth. So yeah, I think that is what the approach should be.
Okay. So while I thank I'm sorry, sit down. I thank our fellow panelists, all of whom are experienced journalists, to have shared both some of their views, their major concerns. I would just like to stress one point. One, there is a need for media practitioners to continually review and improve their practice as individuals and as institutions. Both because that's the job that they are in, and secondly, if nothing else, for self-preservation. Because if they're going to start being tarred with the brush of worst practitioners and best practitioners together, then it's a loss for everyone. Second is, there is need for regulation, but we should be very careful both about regulation and control. Because regulation and control should not pass on powers onto another external agency, whose agenda then we will then be fighting. And we should never lose sight of the fact that our biggest source of strength is the diversity both of news sources, and opinions. That's what keeps us going. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.